Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to AfriForum and Saai's media conference. We especially want to welcome the members of the media. You are always welcome at our offices, and we will after this also of course take questions from the media. Maar dan wil ek ook net graag vir AfriForum en Saai se lede wat op die oomblik regstreeks op ons Facebookblad kyk na hierdie media konferensie sê baie welkom, maar natuurlik ook baie dankie. Dis julle as lede wat dit vir AfriForum en Saai moontlik maak om te sorg dat julle belange gedien word. So baie dankie vir die ondersteuning. I'm just going to start off by welcoming the people on the panel. Next to me, to my right, is Theo de Jager. He's the chairperson of the board of the Southern Africa Agri Initiative, which is the short name is Saai. And of course, he's also, I don't know if many people know that, he's also currently the president of the World Farmers Organization, which I think is one of the top agricultural institutions in the world that works with the UN and many other agricultural unions to make sure that there is food security in the world. So welcome to you. Then to my left, also the best looking member of the panel is Lorraine Claassen. She's a crime analyst at AfriForum. So she'll also speak. And then to my far right, well, far right is not something that's appropriate if you refer to somebody in AfriForum, but that's just his positioning on the panel is Ian Cameron, who's the head of community safety at AfriForum. This is a joint conference, and as you know, AfriForum has in the past made known statistics with regard to farm attacks. We are happy that we can now join hands with Saai in making known these statistics and also to analyze these statistics. Of course, what is important for us is that we have to verify every case that we have. So with every statistic we have a place, a name, and a date. So it can be verified, but of course not too much to be said at the moment. I just want to start off by giving feedback on another matter. As you know, AfriForum has launched an international campaign called The World Must Know, where we are informing the international community with regard to issues where we believe they should play a role. Of course, farm murders that we are speaking about today is one of those issues, so this report will also be used in that campaign. But then there are a number of other issues such as expropriation without compensation, which we feel quite strongly about. You might ask, why do we go to the international community? Well, it's our last resort. We mobilized our members to take part in a public participation process when the Constitutional Review Committee sat in the previous parliament. And as you know, 180,000 of our inputs was simply disregarded. And it seems that the government is hell-bent on going ahead with this. And so as true patriots, we have to make sure that we use every method to get the international community to put pressure on the South African government. Remember, we want investments. We want to make sure that we keep investments in the country. But as happened in Venezuela and Zimbabwe, AfriForum did not tell investors to leave. They left by themselves. And investors would leave us by themselves even if we say nothing. So what we can do is to say we need to save investments in our country. And the best way to do that is to make sure that investors send a clear message to the South African government that they are taking this country on a wrong route. It's not in the interest of the citizens in this country. We know where we've seen expropriation without compensation, like in Zimbabwe. It's not only the 4,000 or 5,000 farmers that were affected. You have a 90% unemployment rate. You have a fuel shortage. You have a food shortage. There's hyperinflation. a currency that's worth nothing. So all people suffer, and as patriots we have to do what we can to make sure that we save the country in the interests of all the people in this country. We are happy with the progress. It's breaking news now. This morning, Secretary of State of the US, Mike Pompeo, held a speech in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia at the African Commission, or the UN's African Economic Commission, and he made a clear statement that he said what is happening in South Africa is dangerous to the people of South Africa, and that expropriation without compensation, he mentioned it by name, is a big danger to the country's economy. So we hope that those decision makers in South Africa would take this seriously. The US is one of the biggest trading partners with South Africa. There's a lot of aid that we get from US aid, and we simply cannot afford to destroy this country because of the ideology of a few members of the political elite. The only people that will benefit with this expropriation without compensation are people like the Friends of Ace Makashule. Like in Zimbabwe, the Friends of the political elite received farms and not the poor. And the only people that will benefit here are people that are linked up with the political elite. And we believe people from all cultures have enough in common. It's their future that's at stake to take a stance against this. But that is just some feedback on that. Ernst Roots, who's head of policy and action at AfriForum, as well as Monique Tauter, who's head of our campaigns. They arrived in New York yesterday. Last night, they had a pre-recorded interview with Tucker Carlson from Fox News. So that will be aired in the US in the near future. There's also interviews lined up with numerous other international media institutions, as well as politicians and opinion makers and think tanks. So we're looking forward for the result. But let's get to the business of the day, and that is farm attacks in South Africa, what the statistics are, what the trends are, and the person best positioned to give us that information is Lorraine Claassen, our crime analyst at AfriForum. Lorraine.
Thank you, Connie. I would just like to thank everyone who helped to make this report possible. All my colleagues at the AfriForum Research Institute, especially Barend Ace, the community safety team, media team, the control room, communications, and the campaign team, as well as the editing team, and especially the graphic designers who did an excellent job with the layout of this report. I also want to note that we are presenting abstract quantitative data analysis today. Each number, figure, and table included in this report, however, refers to people, citizens of our country, victims and the families of victims whose lives have forever been changed by violent acts committed against them, victims whose sense of security and privacy have been gruesomely violated, victims who have suffered immense physical, psychological trauma, as well as monetary losses, who are left to pick up the pieces, and who try to adapt to their new reality as best as they can. I would like to take this opportunity today to offer our condolences to families who have lost their loved ones as a result of farm attacks. We are, however, cognizant of the fact that an unacceptable number of people are murdered throughout South Africa every day. Every murder committed in our country is one too many. I know that we say these words often, and we cannot deny the impact of the loss of life on the citizens of our country. As an introduction, the revised National Rural Safety Strategy was compiled and launched by the South African Police Service, the Division of Visible Policing, on the 11th of October 2019. For effective application and implementation of this strategy, the Rural Safety Strategy relies on the reporting and analysis of farm attacks and farm murder incidents committed in South Africa. With the help of organizations such as TAO SA, who has been collecting data on farm attacks since 1990, and AfriForum, the importance of reliable, valid, and transparent reporting of these crimes became crucial in addressing violence in rural areas. As always, I would like to give the definition of farm attacks as it is adopted in the National Rural Safety Strategy for the purpose of this report. Acts of violence against persons in rural areas. For the purpose of reporting acts of violence against persons living in rural areas, including farms and smallholdings, refer to acts aimed at persons residing in, working in, or visiting rural areas, whether they intend to murder, rape, rob, or inflict bodily harm. In addition, all acts of violence against infrastructure and property in the rural community which are aimed at disrupting farming and or other commercial concerns, irrespective of whether the motives are related to commission of other crimes, ideology, land disputes, land issues, revenge, grievances, racist concerns, or intimidations are included in this definition. Cases related to domestic violence or liquor abuse or resulting from commonplace social interaction between people are excluded from this definition. Regarding data analysis and collection, the integrity of the data from collection to analysis is of the utmost importance in addressing farm attacks. Data is collected and verified by making use of various reliable sources. This includes the South African media who diligently report on individual cases, social media, security networks, and information obtained from victims and the families of the victims themselves. To maintain data integrity, cases where conflicting or insufficient information was available on specific incidents were excluded from this report. All incidents analyzed were verified and the facts were confirmed. It is important to note that for this reason, the farm attack statistics are considered as conservative and are subject to change. Trends from 2010 to 2019. Farm attacks have been increasing from 2011 onwards. For the 2011 calendar year, 552 farm attacks were reported and confirmed. When comparing 2018 to 2019, 27% more farm attacks were recorded by AfriForum. 57 farm murders occurred during 2019, which is 3 more than the previous calendar year. It must be taken into consideration that the number of attacks reported might be less than when compared to the figures of the South African Police Service. There is a significant dark figure related to farm attacks because individual cases are reported at police stations. It is not always reported through security structures, and the media doesn't always report on every attack and every incident committed. On the slide you can see the number of farm attacks per month for the calendar year. It seems as if attacks are spread evenly throughout the year, with only May as an outlier with 61 attacks. Then, for the same period, 57 murders were committed. Because farm murders are widely reported on by the media, this figure is considered a reliable indication of victims who were murdered during farm attacks. In this slide you can see March with a number of 8 attacks committed, and then June, May and April with 6 attacks respectively. The percentage of murders per province is shown in this table on the screen. The number of murders in the Free State increased significantly. The highest number of farm murders occurred after the Free State in Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal and Limpopo province. The specific numbers per province, as you can see, Free State, Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. Remember, this refers to murders, not attacks. And then for the total number of farm attacks per province, Gauteng still accounts for the most farm attacks in the province in South Africa. The reason for this might be the high number of smallholdings and the density of these properties in areas such as Erasmia and Muldersdrift, which enable farm attackers to invade multiple properties during one night. The percentage of the total attacks per province is Gauteng with 30%, Northwest 15%, and Limpopo with 11%. Per province, 59% of the attacks during this period were committed on farms and 37% of attacks on smallholdings. The number of recorded attacks on farms and smallholdings increased in 7 of the 9 provinces of South Africa. The increase in attacks on farms is worrying, as the distance from farms to the nearest towns has always been viewed as a deterrent in identifying the property of which the perpetrators intended to attack. The rural nature of most farms is advantageous to perpetrators, however, in the sense that long distances to neighboring farms provide them with more time to commit the crimes without being noticed by people passing by. To overcome some of the bad condition of rural roads, the vehicles of the victim themselves, which are equipped for the terrain, may be used to flee the scene and are left abandoned once the criminals are able to switch vehicles. Here you can see the correlation of attacks between 2018 and 2019, with an significant increase in Gauteng Province, Northwest, and Limpopo, respectively. When we look at the time of the occurrence in the day of the week, there's no significant difference in the frequency of attacks per day of the week as we've usually seen in the past. Thursday with 16%, Saturday and Friday and Tuesday respectively with 15%. The percentage of total attacks per time of day, and this seems consistent with previous years. The most dangerous times for attacks when they occur is from 1800 in the evening to 3 o'clock in the morning. Then, when we look at the victims of the farm attacks, 905 victims were attacked in 552 farm attacks that were analyzed. 57% of incidents, only 1 victim was attacked, whereas 2 victims were attacked in 30% of incidents reported. Research indicates that the more people present at the intended target on the location, the less likely it is for the attack to occur. In 66% of the incidents, the victims were the owners or the owners' families. The number of workers attacked seems to have increased from past years to 26%. The age of the victims seems consistent with previous years as well. The average age of victims is 55 years. The majority of victims aged between 60 and 79 years old was worrying, with a significant increase of 28% for victims aged between 40 and 59 years. This specifically refers to the presence of the victims and their respected ages in specific incidents reported. Attacks, percentage of crimes committed per incident, I will get to that in a moment. 1,575 perpetrators have been reported as the total number of attackers who committed the crimes. The average number of attackers per incident is 3. It should be noted, however, that the number may be higher due to uncertainty from victims whether there were more attackers involved and or present that they were actually aware of who they saw themselves. It is not uncommon for farm attackers to have lookouts stationed around the properties or to have a getaway vehicle positioned out of sight of the location where the attack occurred. It is commonly reported that attackers wore balaclavas and or gloves in order to conceal their identities or to keep the victim from being able to identify the perpetrators at a later stage. Victims were overpowered, ambushed, and surprised inside the place of residence in the majority of cases. Attackers gained entry by breaking open security doors, burglar bars, doors, windows, or through windows and doors that were left open. The percentage of crimes committed per incident as in this table: assault with the intent to cause grievous bodily harm was committed in 9% of the cases, and attempted murder 26% of the cases. I will say something about that just now. Rape in 3% of cases, kidnapping 2%, torture 4%, and victims murdered in 9% of the cases reported. The percentage of cases, 26%, where the attackers attempted to murder one or all of the victims, is extremely worrying. This shows that the perpetrators intended to murder the victims, although the victims survived. The number of farm murders would have been higher if the attackers were successful in carrying out their intentions. In 9% of the incidents reported, one or more of the victims were murdered. Other information worth noting is 18% of females were raped during this period. In some cases, the victims were raped by more than one attacker. One or more of the victims were kidnapped during the attack in 11 incidents recorded. One or all of the victims were subjected to various means of torture in 22 incidents. Some of these means of torture included burning victims with plastic, clothing irons, or boiling water, or being doused in petrol and threatened to set alight. Arson was committed intentionally by setting a house alight in 3 cases reported, twice with the victims locked inside. The use of knives, pangas, axes, and other sharp objects during attacks suggests that the perpetrators are willing and able to come within direct contact of the victims in order to cause physical harm. These weapons are also preferred by some attackers, as the risk of being hurt would be less as opposed to using a firearm, especially where small holdings are concerned. Other weapons used included torches, sheep shearers, screwdrivers, and other tools. Then I just want to allude to the National Rural Safety Strategy. As I said, it was released in October last year. The strategy is compiled, and there is 8 different pillars where the Division of Visible Policing includes the focus and the intention of addressing the crimes within the strategy. One pillar that I want to mention is Pillar 6, the community involvement and stakeholder collaboration. The goal is to mobilize community to support and enhance safety and security in rural and urban environments. They specifically allude in the strategy to collaboration with all relevant stakeholders across all levels. And then I just want to mention Pillar 8, which refers to monitoring and evaluation, and I think this is crucial in measuring the success of the rural safety strategy. Then, in conclusion, in one of the farm attacks cases reported, the husband told his wife they're coming. Victims and families of victims are left with severe trauma and emotional and psychological damage. The most horrific details of these crimes are often not those which are reported. It is crucial to provide the much needed support, especially emotional support, to the victims of violent crime. Communities are, as always, encouraged to become involved with security networks in the area. I'm sure Ian will allude to that further. It is essential to make it as difficult as possible for attackers to gain access to the dwellings. And that is it from my side. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you, Lorraine, for you and your team. I know this is quite hard work, but important work, so we thank you. Next to speak is Ian Cameron. As I've mentioned, he is Head of Community Safety at AfriForum, and I'm just going to pass over the microphones.
Thank you very much. I'm going to elaborate a little bit, but before I do that, I think it's important just to create some context. as to community safety and the rural safety strategy. And I'm going to explain a lot of it in more depth now. But to do that, there's an overview on the screen for you with an infographic that basically summarizes everything that Lorraine has mentioned. So I might refer to that while I speak about the solution regarding community safety and the crucial role that communities play in combating the scourge of farm attacks. Just for information's sake, the latest attack or the latest murder seems to have happened just after last Thursday. I don't know the exact date yet, but 2 bodies of 2 men in their 50s were found in Maclear in the Eastern Cape within the last 24 hours. 3 suspects have already been arrested. Both of them had their throats slit and were found tied up next to each other in a room on a small holding, obviously Maclear in the Eastern Cape. Why do I say this? I think it's important that we keep on telling the stories of victims, although that's not the role of today. It's crucial that no victim just becomes a number. So it's important that every time it happens, we need to mention it and we need to tell the story of every single victim, and they must never be forgotten, because it's a tragedy that affects every single one of us in this room and every single person watching or listening. With the increase and hardly any improvement in service delivery from government when it comes to farm attacks, it's quite clear that we are on our own when it comes to rural safety. I think it's very clear that the South African Police Service on a national level has thus far actually failed in their mandate to safeguard people in rural communities. I've got a lot of respect for so many of the ground level police officials that do their utmost best to assist communities with very limited manpower, resources, and even knowledge in many cases due to training not being up to scratch. Why do I say this? I think we need to emphasize how much more a community can and must do in order for them to be safer. When we look at the local police strategy, we often see that policemen are very willing and unfortunately still lacking with the amount of people that are available. We can see that the local strategy, the rural safety strategy up to now has not really worked. There's a lot of talk about it. There's a lot of input being provided by different stakeholders, including the police, but we don't see a change happening. And it's obvious when you look at the stats for the last 2 years and the 100 annual increase of attacks actually over the past 3 years, it's very clear that their strategy hasn't worked. But what does the murder figure show us? The fact that the murder figure has stabilized to this point, this doesn't mean we mustn't consider murder as being serious or not tell it as a tragedy that it is. But the fact that attempted murder and attempted murder has increased so much, but that the murder figure itself has stabilized, gives us an idea that communities are fighting back. And that's a very important point to raise. Last year, over just over 500 attacks that we saw throughout the year, 10 attackers were shot dead in the process. That's not mentioning the ones that were injured or that were arrested by the community or by the farmer or by workers on that farm and then handed over to the police. It's a very important message to share, that people are sick and tired of waiting for government to come and help them or to assist them. And even though we will carry on putting pressure on government, we're not going to sit back and wait for them to do it. And the reason is simple. There's more than enough room within the legislation at hand for us to act within the framework of the law and to make sure that we protect ourselves, our families, our neighbors, and our communities. AfriForum has approached this a little differently, because we said, apart from raising awareness by sharing statistics and putting it in social media and so on, we need to start training communities. We need to empower people to know what they can and can't do, what are the legal consequences, what are the legal procedures that must be followed by communities when they act in the fight against violence in rural areas. Now, I think to give context to that, it's very clear when we go to court cases or that when we look at police investigations, that the investigation is either not done to a standard that it can even reach a court, or the MPA don't do their job properly to make sure that the prosecution is done successfully. So you're really sitting with a problem where you can't just blame police, or you can't just blame government, or just the MPA. There are so many stakeholders and role players that are causing this utter deterioration of law and order in rural areas. AfriForum has now trained just over 5,000 people in 2019, and I'm going to share with you the different modules that we look at. I'm going to explain why each of those have a significant influence on making sure that that murder figure either decreases or stays stable, because that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that it doesn't increase anymore, and slowly but surely we need to keep on winning the fight. It's very clear by the increase of attacks that the onslaught is very serious, that it is an epidemic in rural areas in South Africa, but more people are surviving compared to previous years. We started looking at legal aspects when we look at, for example, what patrollers need to do. We've got just over 12,000 patrollers that are involved in these community safety structures, and they need to understand what to do when they, for example, arrive at a crime scene, what they can and can't do. They need to know that before police or any form of forensic team arrives at that scene, how to cordon it off, how to make sure that any forensic evidence isn't contaminated in any way, and that we conserve a scene as best we can before the police or any other officials should get there. We look at the orientation in respect of community protection. How do you protect your community? It's a crucial point that people don't seem to know, and it's important that we understand that, because we can't keep asking government to do it for us, because they have failed us in every single way thus far for over the past 10 years when it comes to community safety. Understanding the Firearm Control Act. I think it's a very relevant topic at the moment, but people need to know how to handle firearms and how to defend themselves with it. With that, we're making it very clear that we encourage the use of firearms for self-protection when it comes to the rural community, and obviously it needs to go along with the relevant responsibility and with the relevant law-abiding citizenship that those people need to enforce, or need to the way they behave themselves with those firearms. We look at patrols in rural areas, self-defense and anti-hijacking, basic radio communication and first aid. There was a case that we handled in the Eastern Cape a few years ago where the state ambulance didn't have any fuel to go and pick up the victims of the attack. And it was incredible to see that the taxi association, along with the farmers, provided the relevant transport for those victims to be transported to the nearest most relevant hospital. And that's the direction that we're moving into. We don't give first aid so you can, stick on plasters or something like that. It really is to save lives. And we've realized that first responders are almost always out of the community, and we need to make sure that they're empowered to a point where they know how to maintain or handle themselves in such a situation. Command and control in community safety structures, it's crucial. We don't have something like commandos anymore or anything like that, but what we do have is a framework within the law that we can use to our benefit when it comes to safeguarding the community, whether it's through communication, having emergency plans, contingency plans. We can use those plans and initiatives to the best of the community, and we can clearly see that in the communities that these plans are practiced and used as a show of force along with the relevant officials like the South African Police Service. It's very clear that there is often a decrease in violence. Then we look at victim support. We often look past this point. It's crucial that victims get the relevant support after they have survived something so terrible like a farm attack. I don't think we always realize the influence that farm attacks, for example, have on all the workers that surround that farm. We had a case in the Western Cape just over a year ago where a farmer was murdered, and we had to provide counseling for more than 17 workers for a space of over a month. The point is, people don't realize that this destroys the livelihood of an entire community. It means people can't eat, not just the farmer's family, but everyone that works on that farm. And I think that's where it comes to the point where the trauma, whether a farm worker or a farmer or anyone else on that farm is attacked, is immense for the people that live in that direct area. Then we look at the collection of information for the community to be able to predict threats and mitigate risk. We've come to a point in some places where the frequency of attacks, especially in areas of small holdings, is so high that if we don't start to collect the information in a way that it can start telling us when we can expect attacks, what time of the day, which days, and why, that we can't use or utilize our patrols in the correct way. And this should be a function of the police. It should be something that comes from crime intelligence that they provide to the community, obviously within the limits of the law, and that the community can then say, but we need to look out for this, that, or the other. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen, so the community must do it themselves. Crime scene coordination, as I've mentioned already, I can think of the Narko Drotsky case. Up to this day, the correct affidavits weren't taken from Narko and his family after that attack. So up to this day, the police have done more or less nothing. The investigative officer has changed more than 3 times in that case. Mani Entris, whose wife was murdered just before Narko Drotsky was shot in the same area, still has shown no arrests. And so I can go on with more examples. The point being that if we don't know how to coordinate a scene like that, it makes it even more difficult for the police that are often few and far in between to come and coordinate the scene correctly. On that scene, patrollers found the gloves of the attackers that were left behind, not forensic. The scene wasn't cordoned off as it was meant to have been cordoned off. The police drove over some of the cartridges that were left on the driveway into the house. I actually found 2 of those cartridges. So I can go through more examples. The point is, if we don't know how to cordon off scenes properly and we don't control it properly and provide support to the ground level officials, we cannot expect to solve the problem. So we need to be proactive and we need to train and prepare ourselves. We've established a national communication network where communities can communicate with each other. We've got just over 6,000 radios where communities can not only communicate nationally but also provincially, also locally. They can then speak to each other, share information, and obviously we would like them to be able to stop the incidents before they happen. And this also puts a lot of help into providing emergency medical services and any other emergency service that might be needed. It's important that no victim should be left alone. So in the past year, to give you an idea of the network, as Lorraine said earlier, the families are often left behind and we kind of forget about it because the violence that we encounter in South Africa has almost become the norm. It's as though we just accept it. And we don't realize the effect that it has on victims, and often it only hits them years after the incident actually has happened. We've supported just over 100 victims over the past year that were attacked in around 70 attacks of those 552. And we will obviously continue with all of the activities that I've mentioned. In conclusion, it's quite simple. I think I need to summarize everything in 4 reasons why the farming community must and can defend themselves and what they need to do in order for that to be successful. Firstly, South African government has failed in its constitutional mandate to safeguard citizens, their families and their property in rural areas. And you are most likely on your own during a violent farm attack. South African police does not have the ability or capacity to stop violent crime on farms before it happens, nor do private security firms. And the 100+ attacks on average that we've seen in the increase for the past 3 years indicates that very clearly. Then the third point, a responsible, well-trained and law-abiding female gun owner with a gun on a farm levels the playing field against any attacker or rapist double her size. Because that's something that we're also seeing increasing, is the amount of rapes that take place during farm attacks. Law-abiding, well-trained gun owners on farms have improved situational awareness of their surroundings too. Lastly, if you can defend yourself, you can defend your family. And if you can defend your family, you can defend your neighbors. If neighbors defend each other, they can defend a community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Theo de Jager is going to speak next, so we don't have to move the microphones. I just want to refer to something. In one of the documents you have at the bottom, it is said that Theo de Jager is the president of the World Agricultural Organization. It's actually the World Farmers Organization. But on our website, the correct information is available to you, but you have your opportunity.
Thank you, Kali. Thank you also for the opportunity to have networked with AfriForum. Saai is a network for family farmers, and we try not to duplicate any functions, so we set up networking partnerships with organizations that already have capacity. There's no bigger capacity at this stage across our country to mobilize rural communities against crime and against farm attacks than AfriForum has, and hence this partnership. From a global perspective, South Africa is right there amongst the top contenders of most dangerous areas to farming. Others are, of course, the war zones in the Middle East, especially Syria. But in that case, it is a war that is mostly affecting cities, and the rural areas is just an extension of that. Other areas where we have a similar pressure on the safety of farmers is the northeastern areas of Nigeria, the northeastern areas of Congo, northeastern areas of Kenya, and northeastern areas of Mozambique over the last few weeks. In the case of South Africa, as you have seen, the problem is spread across the whole country. It is currently more dangerous to be a farmer in South Africa than to be a policeman, simply based on the number of attacks and the number of farm murders. Often I am being asked across the world by other farmers' organizations, and in my capacity I also often meet with governments. You have a problem with crime in general in your country. Isn't farm attacks just an extension of crime that is also prevalent in the Cape Flats and in rural communities in general, in townships? And it's not. Farm attacks and farm murders is not just an extension of crime in South Africa. And there are three very important distinctions. Firstly, no political party calls for murders elsewhere in our country. There's never a call, kill an inhabitant of the Cape Flats, kill a gangster, like you have kill a farmer, kill the boer. The rest is not being called for. Secondly, the nature of these attacks is much different. In attacks on households on the Cape Flats or in rural towns and rural villages, you do not have the same brutality, torture. They do not drill into the kneecaps of Noma or take out her eyes. And thirdly, after these attacks, there is not the same cry out in social media, especially on Twitter, like you'll have on farm attacks. Well done, there should be more. And there are thousands of them. Actually, it's embarrassing when you address governments elsewhere in the world to explain that there is no follow-up on this kind of comments on social media. For us as farmers, we accept, firstly, that this is not a race-based thing. Farmers who are attacked and farmers who are murdered are not only white farmers. We have a similar problem with all the other race groups. Secondly, it's not only us as farm owners or primary producers, as you have seen, 26%. It's also on our workers. And we are extremely concerned with the rise in the number of attacks on our workers too. And thirdly, we have accepted a while ago that no one is going to do something about it if we don't do something about it. And it's of absolute importance that every farming family in our country must have a plan on how to deal with attacks. And it's not only for that family, it's for that community. How do we help each other? How do you help your neighbor when there's attack? How do you close the valley in which you farm? How do you mobilize all other resources, local security firms, the local police, the farmers' organization, even churches who these days have emergency plans to ensure that communities do it for themselves when there are farm attacks. Of course, we dream of a day when this thing will be over. Of course, we hope that there will be a new normal one day when this will not be the stain on our current time history. I actually represent the Zimbabwean farmers at the World Farmers Organization. I've been nominated by them. My family used to farm there. And we have something different to Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe never had this phenomenon. Of course, there were also farm attacks. There were also farm murders, but not a patch of what we see here. I have to report back very often, and every time I visit Zimbabwe, they sympathize with us. Guys, hang in there. Like we used to sympathize with them. Guys, hang in there. Things will be better soon. And lastly, this is not an agricultural problem. This is not a farmer's problem. This is a problem for South Africa as a whole. And it needs a national strategy. We need to put more pressure on government to have a national strategy against farm attacks. We need to put pressure on government to set up a special unit in the police to take care of this. Government needs to put more resources into this, and it will not do so unless we put enough pressure, both internally and externally. Hence, we call on each and every South African there. Let's do something about these numbers, and let's push for a new normal.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Theo. Thank you very much. Thank you, Theo. I just want to state one thing, and it's important, especially for AfriForum's members and Saai's members that are watching. When we see farm attacks, and you also look at the crime in the country as a whole, and I also want to speak to people in this country as a whole, it's very easy to become despondent, and it's right to be angry with regard to what is happening. People should not be tortured, people should not be killed, people should not be hurt. So there's no problem with being angry. But if you become despondent and just sit back and say, well, we live in a terrible country and it's not going to change, there's no future, you will not change anything. So for me, the importance when I looked at our report that we are launching today is that it actually also has a message of hope. It's terrible that there are 57 people that were killed. But the message of hope is that there has been a rise in farm attacks by 27%. Of course, that is not the message of hope. And the message of hope is that the murders did not rise by 27%. So that means the message of hope is that our safety is also in our own hands. And where you mobilize communities, you set up community safety structures within the framework of the law, you are able to fight back, and that is how you can make sure that the murder rate doesn't rise with the same kind of numbers that we see the attacks rising. So I want to thank rural communities for their efforts that they have put in to make this possible. And if we make sure that we strengthen our structures, that we do more faster, then we can win this fight. And of course, we also want to speak to people in towns. People in towns, we know in towns and in cities and in townships, there's a lot of crime problems. But the message is also there. In the urban areas where we also have community safety structures, we've seen a reduction in crime. And that is why this message of hope for people is to say, get involved in your community, get involved with community safety structures, and if you do exactly that, we will take the fight to the criminals, and we see well-trained people criminals have paid with their lives when they wanted to take the lives of farmers, and that should also send a message to criminals that people are tired of the crime we are seeing. We are mobilizing ourselves, and we will not be despondent. We will build a future for our children in this country, for all our children in this country, and the way to do that is active citizens that mobilize within the framework of the law, and that is exactly what we are doing. Just with regard to a second aspect, the question many times asked, do you want people on farms to have preferential treatment? Are the lives of farmers more important than the lives of anybody else? And the clear answer to that question is no. What we want to see for farmers and farm workers and people in rural communities, we want to see equal treatment for them. And when I say that specific crime problem should also get attention as other specific crimes. For instance, if you look at gang violence in the Western Cape, which is terrible. There's a large number, like farm murders, gang murders in the Western Cape is disproportionately high if you consider it with regard to the number of people staying on, for instance, the Cape Flats. It's disproportionate with regard to the number of farmers killed, even if it's a much lower number than the country as a whole. But if you take it proportionately with regard to the number of farmers, it's disproportionately high. And in a case such as gang violence, the government has set up a specific task team to tackle gang violence because it's a specific kind of crime that needs a specific kind of reaction. When you have, for instance, a problem with rhino poaching, a special team is being set up. It does not mean the lives of rhinos are more important than the lives of elephants, but it's a specific crime problem that needs a specific reaction. And that is all we're asking. So we need in the country specific task teams to look at violence against women and children. Not because violence against men is acceptable. The fact is just there's a specific problem that needs a specific reaction. And we want government to say we are willing to recognize, yes, a specific problem where the murder rate is disproportionately high. And we are going to, like in the case we have with gang violence and rhino poaching and copper cable theft, we are going to have specific teams focusing on this. And it's unfortunate that it doesn't happen, and we'll continue to push for that. Because they're trying to deny the problem, you had a ludicrous situation where the president in New York said there are no farm murders in South Africa. So we will continue to pressurize through international pressure, but of course we also say let's organize ourselves, cooperate. We see if you want unity and diversity, you should see it with regard to community safety structures, where people from various communities cooperate, because we have one common goal and one common enemy, and that is, of course, the criminals. That's enough said from my side. Maybe if there's are some questions, maybe I can just start off. If there's a question for okay, let me just find out, are there any people that wants to ask question to Lorraine? Then I just want to make sure I don't want to move the microphone after every question. Yeah.
Good morning, Hope Joyce from ENCA.
Are you asking
For Lorraine.
For Lorraine. Okay, let's start with questions for Lorraine, and then. Thank you very much. Okay, Gerard.
Good morning. Just in terms of, there's a lot of criticism that has been given about the amount of murders per day and then the amount of farm murders, and that has been explained by you. I'm just looking at the figure that you mentioned here, 59% occurred on farms and 37% on small holdings. Given the definition that you have given, people that live on a small holding aren't necessarily farmers and that contribute to the breadbasket of South Africa. So isn't there a sense of criticism to call it farm murders, even though more than a third do not occur on farms itself? So how do you tackle an issue like that?
Mostly we recognize that small holdings falls under a police station that can be classified as urban, rural, or rural itself. So when it is urban, rural, or rural, the small holding within that area, within that vicinity, would be considered as a farm attack. Sorry for the small, short answer, but that is.
Okay, of course, it's also not our decision to include that. It's the police's own method of getting these statistics. But I think what is important, though, is that you have to look at certain crimes and what kind of strategy should be used. If you are going to classify those small holdings as an urban area, it would be wrong because you can't use the same crime-fighting tactics. And I think there's a big relation between the strategies you need to fight that with regard to what is on farms as such. You also need much of the same methods we use on farms can also work on these so-called small holdings.
Hi, my name is Malunge from Newsroom Africa. I just want to get an understanding, though. Have you been able, in terms of these attacks, been able to establish, in terms of the perpetrators, whether if there's a conflict between a farmer and the employees, that on itself could result in an attack? Have you been able to sort of like, in these figures that you've shown us, that you say this attack was a result of a conflict over whatever the conflict was about?
If there is a conflict of employees currently employed on the farm when the attack occurred, oftentimes that would be classified as a domestic dispute.
Even though it could result into
Even
an
though-
extreme case of
course.
murder, for example.
Of course. There is cases, however, that was classified as farm attacks where the employees, they were previous employees for months or years afterwards, and then they would return. So that would say for us that they came with the intention to the farm, to the property, even though they were not allowed on the property anymore to commit a violent crime. Do you understand?
So there were no current.
No.
If I have a dispute with my boss, who's a farmer, and then
because they are
Alright,
known
let's
to
go fines.
because they are known to each other. Yes. So the definition specifically says aimed at persons residing, working on, or visiting rural areas, whether they intend to murder, rape, or rob, or inflict bodily harm. So the focus is on someone coming from the outside with the intent to commit harm. So that excludes current relations. That's not applicable for this definition.
Okay, so just in short, I think the statistics don't include any case where a farmer was murdered by one of his or her workers.
Oh, vice
Current
versa.
workers,
Yeah.
or vice versa,
Okay.
as far as I know.
Any other questions for Lorraine?
Nico van Buren, Harper Weekblad. In general, how does your figures compare to the police statistics? Although it's not over the same period of the year.
We release statistics in conjunction or in the same time for financial year in accordance with the months that the police release their figures. So those figures we will release specifically concerning the financial year in the end of April as the police count their financial year. But the number of farm attacks, I am quite certain that we may have less attacks on our database as what the police have, simply because we don't pick up on all the attacks. It's not all of the farm attacks are not reported in the media, unfortunately, but you can't report on 52 murders in the country per day if you are a reporter or a news media. So there's a lot of cases reported to police stations that we simply don't know about, and those are included in the police's figures.
Lorraine, am I correct, if I understood correctly, looking at our previous figures, the police murder figures are always lower than ours?
Not necessarily, but it's closer in relation to each other. So that might differ with 2 or 3 cases, but it's much more reliable, the murder figure, if you compare it to the figure of attacks that might be higher.
Any other questions for Lorraine? Thank you. I'm going to give the mics here to Ian and Theo, and then you can ask any one of them.
You realize that you have now skipped yourself.
They want to ask the experts questions, not me, so it's fine. Yes, sir.
Hi, Ian. It's Malungelo from Nation Africa. I want to make sure that I heard you correctly when you're saying that. Or did you say? Perhaps let me ask you like this. Did you say that farmers must arm themselves?
Yes.
Is that what you said?
100% correct. Yeah, that's my answer. 100% correct. It's quite simple. We see that the Minister of Police is saying things in the media where he encourages people to hand in firearms. I don't know how many amnesties we've had, but not in one of those amnesties have I seen or heard of any criminal handing in a gun. So now, innocent law-abiding citizens are handing in, and they're intimidated by statements made by the Minister of Police, and they are being disarmed. But it's quite simple that when you disarm law-abiding citizens, the criminals will still be armed. And therefore we say that we encourage it, but that being said, it goes along with responsible firearm ownership. It goes along with being trained to handle that firearm and with the relevant safekeeping of that firearm. It doesn't help that you have a firearm, but you just keep it in the safe the whole time. You're going to struggle a little bit when they attack you and you need to go to your safe first. So it's crucial that people train themselves, and if it's not with a firearm or with another form of a weapon, that they are able to efficiently defend themselves, then that's fine too. The point is, people need to be able to defend themselves, and we cannot wait for government to assist. In so many cases, we have been to crime scenes, and specifically farm attack scenes, where the police took hours to show up. Let's go back to the Nakadrotsky case. The first cops that got to the scene didn't even get out of the car. So if someone had a firearm that day and they were prepared for what was about to happen, it might have turned out a little differently.
The National Rural Safety Strategy, you've slammed it. I'm curious though, were you not consulted before this strategy?
I think, just a correction, we don't slam the strategy, we slam the fact that it's not implemented. Because we hear of a new strategy every few years, and it's always talked about, and it's actually a fantastic document on paper. I mean, Lorraine would agree with me. If you read even the previous rural safety strategy, it was fantastic, but it's not implemented. Now you go to a cop. I was in court the other day, and I listened to a detective that had to appear on the stand, and he explained how his vehicle had more than 380,000 kilometers on it. So that vehicle is more likely, or most of the time, it will be in a mechanic workshop than it will be on the road busy with police work. That's my point. Okay, so it's the implementation rather than anything else.
Just to add, there's a saying to say that a bad person with a gun can only be stopped by a good person with a gun, and I think it's appropriate.
Sorry, I want to add something to that actually, Kali. You know, I think there's a misperception in South Africa, and it's often pushed by government that we need to be aware of violence against women and children. But we never hear that government encourage women and children, and specifically women, to start defending themselves, because there's so much that they can do within the framework of the law to defend themselves. Something like rape. There are so many things that women would be able to learn to stop that from happening to them, and we need to empower people to be able to do that. So a woman on a farm that is able to handle a gun properly and that is able to defend herself is a fantastic thing. It happened last week. I think it was in Northwest. I can go look up the case. I think it was in Bloemhof, where a lady was ambushed by 3 attackers. She managed to get loose. She ran into the house, got a revolver, and the attackers all fled on foot. Those are the types of stories we want to start hearing.
Patricia from the SABC. Would it be correct to say that you are encouraging a culture of fight fire with fire? That's the one. And then the second is, are you not perhaps concerned of having the reverse effect? Criminals are always shopping for weapons. are you not scared that they might now target farms more because they would know that most farms are heavily armed, and not necessarily to attack? Obviously, they'd be looking for the weapons for other crimes, but you know what would happen in that incident, obviously. So are you not concerned about that? And if you are concerned, how are you planning to tackle that in terms of conscientizing farmers that criminals might target them more, looking for the weapons that they have to protect themselves, obviously?
It's a very good question. I'm going to answer the latter one first. I would say that it goes along with training, responsible firearm ownership. It would be easy for anyone to call, let's take up arms. It would be a very irresponsible thing to say something like that, especially when it comes to people not being responsible with firearms. You need to be able to handle a firearm, you need to be able to control a situation with a firearm, you need to be able to defend yourself with a firearm. If you aren't able to do that, you shouldn't own one. It's as simple as that. When it comes to fighting fire with fire, take a life to save a life. If my wife or my child is in danger and someone is pointing a gun at them and I can save their lives, I will do it. And that is the same for any other South African citizen. If you're in danger and the police aren't there to protect you as they are meant to, and it would be unreasonable to say they need to be at every single crime. There's just too much. The point is, we need to be able to defend ourselves. So I wouldn't quite word it to say fight fire with fire, because I think it creates a misperception. I would rather say that you need to defend the lives of innocent people, and if that means that you need to act in a certain way to do that, then it is the right thing to do.
My question, I'm Rorisang from The Citizen. My question is for Theo Diacher. You listed some African countries that are have issues of rural farm safety. I just wanted to understand from those countries, are they experiencing similar brutal attacks as in South Africa? And is it worse than it is in South Africa in those countries?
In the other countries on our continent, much of the attacks have got to do with either religious or political civil war. In the northeastern parts of Nigeria, there are many more abductions and kidnappings than in South Africa. And it's mostly women and children who are the victims. In the Goma area in DRC, you have these insurgents from the mountains. It's probably the highest number of rapes, and it's mostly women farmers. In Congo DR, the vast majority of the farmers are women. And the stories are as brutal as what you hear, but we do not have this number of murders. In the northeastern side of Kenya, these attacks are associated to Al-Shabaab, and it's usually a struggle for resources. You see that this massive volumes of things are stolen by insurgents. But also there, you do not have this number of murders. It's not the same kind of thing. It's more like a kind of a civil war. Lately, we also have radical Islam insurgents in the northeastern parts of Mozambique, and smallholder farms are targeted also to get to resources, to get to food and to get to vehicles. The kind of attacks we have here is much different. It's much more sophisticated, it's much less coordinated, and it's not really associated with any organized kind of conflict. You cannot say it's this group that comes in. It's criminals who come in, and very often the reason why farms are more vulnerable is because they are so much further from each other. They are so much further from police, and farmers are more vulnerable in that regard. To get your neighbors to you takes so much longer. And there's time for the kind of torture which is associated to it.
Hi, I'm Christian Duplessis, I'm from Netwerk 24. Ek het ook 'n vraag vir u. do you think that crime or farm attacks is not related to crime in South Africa at all? Because I think since state capture we have seen a rise in all crime in South Africa and achteruitgang wat die land dan betreft. Do you not think that or how do you think that relates to farm murders in that way?
Yeah. Of course, there will be a big overlap, but as I have said, in the other kinds of attacks, and especially in other in murders elsewhere, you do not have this whipping up of emotion. It's not called for by political parties and chanting and songs. It's not as brutal. It's not the same kind of torture that goes with it. Once you've been on one of these scenes, and I know Ian has been to many more than I have, but you only need to attend one of them, and you can never forget it in your life. The anger behind it, the blood all over, and then afterwards, this praising of what happened there on social media. Great, we need more of it, and as if the relationship between farmers in South Africa and the rest of the community is that bad. It's simply not true. Farmers live on the same yard as their workers. When a farm worker's wife is sick, everybody on that farm is affected. If a farmer's child is sick, everybody on that yard is affected. We live so much closer to each other than in cities. It's not like a factory where you're not in contact with each other. If you do not pitch up at work, you are at work all the time. And we have a phenomenon in South Africa which you do not have in Europe, for example, where farm workers and farmers also come generations, where they've been together for 3 or 4 generations. It's like being family. You know everything about each other. If farmers had the poor relationship with their workers, as which is often portrayed in the media, farms will grind to a halt. In the nature of our farming enterprises in South Africa, the integration between family life and business is such that it is impossible not to have good relations. Farmers who worked like that, who had poor relations, either stop farming or will have mechanized. And this should actually not happen. In South Africa, we need more labor-intensive farms. We need to create the jobs where it is most needed, and that's in the deep rural areas.
You mentioned that there were about 5,000 people trained by AfriForum in 2019. Were they trained in firearms and how to handle firearms?
No. So if they want to do that on a volunteer level, they're more than welcome to obviously organize it amongst themselves in communities, as a lot of the shooting clubs or sport shooting clubs and so on do. So obviously we would encourage them to have as much training as possible, but the training that we do provide is understanding the Firearm Control Act. It's important that people understand the theory behind it, understand what they can and can't do.
Thank you very much. Have a great day and thank you for coming.